Welcome to the In the Middle podcast, a podcast where we talk about every avenue of life because life really takes place in the middle, not the beginning, not the end. How do we navigate the middle? Welcome everybody to our next episode of In the Middle, and Lenny is back. We may be back for a few weeks because our last episode we talked about this whole area around mental health, and there's so much going around. And since our last episode, I've had multiple conversations with people around this subject, and as a result of that, I think we should talk about the things that people need us to talk about. There's nothing worse than giving answers to questions that nobody's asking. And so that's what we're going to be doing. And so we're kind of continuing. If you missed our last episode, just go ahead, pause this one, go back one, listen to the previous one. And they're timeless. So whenever you want to listen to them, that's all great. And then I know for sure we'll have at least one more episode because there is some really important things to talk about. So welcome back, Lenny.
Thank you, sir.
We just had a brief conversation, actually, just for you listening to us. Lenny, just give us your childhood story. Give us kind of those first few years of your life, how you got to Arizona, and anything funny along the way.
Okay. So I grew up right outside of Buffalo, New York. I can start off with a sad note, I guess. Deregulation took place. And when deregulation took place, businesses were opened up. And so what happened because of that, big businesses came into the small little suburbs that we lived in, kind of took over. So when that happened, that's what made the move happen. So my dad had to pick up. We had to figure out a new start. He worked for a trucking company, and the big trucking companies came in, and it changed the, a lot of blue collar families were moving out of the States at that time. So that's how it started. But for me, the interesting thing is that when I did get here, I was telling Des that because the school system was so far ahead than the one that was in Arizona at the time, they thought I was intelligent, and they put me in the AP programs, which would be like the advanced placement programs. And about 6 months later, they realized that wasn't the case, and they put me back with just the regular standard kids. And I was saying that my humor was disruptive at the time, so I wasn't really the best fit for the advanced placement programs. But I thought it was kind of funny because they thought that because of the school system. So it's interesting what happens when you relocate, especially when you think it's going to be the same and it ends up not being the same. So,
but what's interesting, and this is what I think this is an intentional connection. You identify as like a New York guy, a New York kid to some degree.
To some degree, yeah.
And so that early years up to the age of whatever, 12
Yeah,
that
it
it
was like
was,
11, 12,
kind of
yeah.
formed who you were. And there is something about even our childhood years with identity. I know there is for mine. Like I was only 8 years old when we left Australia to move. My parents moved back to England, but I'd always lived in Australia. But to this day, I have a strong affection with the place of my birth. I just do it. And so in some ways it shapes my identity. And then my kids, when we moved from England to here, my youngest, Zach, was only 11. And so he spent more years now in the US than he did in England.
Yeah.
And so really he's had more influence from this culture than he maybe did from that culture. Let's just talk about this thing about identity and labels, picking up from last time. So I read this quote that said, there is a difference between acknowledging your pain and your struggle or making your pain your identity. There's a difference in acknowledging it rather than making it your identity, because we talked about how people are labeling some of these mental health conditions or struggles, and it's saying, I am anxious or I have anxiety rather than all of that. So I want you to lean into that. Let's just talk around why we want to label and what we can do in a better way, a healthier way. Yeah, let's talk about
I think we start with some foundation on the idea of a label or of, putting a statement to something to make it be more real. Labeling is, just as a caveat to this, it's one of 25 common mental mistakes that exist in our thinking processes, which can generate anxiety, which was the topic last time.
Yeah.
Labeling's one of them. And essentially, the good and the bad of it is the fundamental purpose for labeling is so that it makes sense to me. So that if I go into a room, we can use the one we're in right now, we label the things around us so that it makes sense. A chair, a table, a microphone, whatever it is, because I'm going to interact with that and I want to do it in some way that's appropriate. I want it to seem normal to me and I want it to be able to be accessible to me. And so I'm going to categorize it, and it happens very quickly. We do the same thing with people. You go into a room and you, without knowing anything, your version, what your upbringing, like you pointed out, allows you to identify. And you may walk in a room and say tall person, short person, male, female, beard, no beard, whatever it is. We do this fast. Now, we don't have to necessarily be accurate with that. That's not what it's for. It's so that I can make sense out of it. It's a child that I'm about to talk to instead of an adult or instead of somebody who's older. I need that identification, and it helps me make my next step. Now, that happens really quick. So you're not, dwelling on it. This is why sometimes we get into a situation we don't quite read the room. We might make a mistake with our label. That's easily fixable. So the issue then that we're going to explore is that once the label happens, which is a biological functioning kind of thing, which we need to sort of back off of and stop being so critical of, it's how do you behave it? What kind of thing do you follow it up with now that you've had that identification so you can make sense out of it? Do you have room left so that if you were a little off or maybe wrong, you could adjust?
Right.
You could have flexibility.
Right.
And I think that the more you're exposed to, you used the word earlier, capacity, when we were talking off camera, capacity to adjust is important. So now the label doesn't become something that has to stick or harm me. It's still just the way that I'm navigating what's in front of me. That's not a bad thing. That's a normal thing. Just like anxiety was normal, this is normal. To label is for me to make sense so I can approach it somewhere in the ballpark. So that's the beginning of it. Go ahead.
So some of the labels that we will like hearing, that I'm seeing, and I want you to speak into it, common ones are, well, because I have anxiety, I therefore, because I have, and it could be diagnosed, because I have ADHD, therefore, because I have whatever it may be. There's a mental health struggle, but they seem to put it as an identity. It then, and I heard this said, people are then, it gives me comfort rather than how can I increase my capacity to do that. So talk about the labeling again, and I want to get into that area of capacity or resiliency building, because for some people, and I want to be sensitive. For some people, I almost feel like the labeling in this struggle that people are having just limits them, incredibly limits them, and it becomes almost an excuse to not stretch, to not increase capacity. So
if you take that piece that you just said and you add the idea of comfort, let me give you another analogy. I think those are good. I think someone we love dearly used a lot of analogies and metaphors to make complicated things simple, right? Thank you, Jesus. All right, so here's the thing. You work a job. Say you're there for a number of years, maybe 10 years, maybe 12 years. You can get comfortable in that job. Now, that in of itself may not necessarily be negative to you, because it may mean balance. It may mean it's structure. It may mean it's giving me what I need. The paycheck is appropriate, and I know the people I work with. So we have to be careful when we use the words, that we're understanding that comfort, depending on how you're perceiving it, can come across as negative or positive.
Yes.
The word itself is neutral, like consequence. It's a neutral word. It doesn't necessarily mean bad. And so the idea that you're comfortable with something actually can help you excel if you're conscious of the idea that the reason that comfort is necessary is so you can be flexible and you can move in a direction and you can increase and you can add, because you're not going to stress out your foundation. So that's a good positive way.
Right.
Comfort negative is I don't want to risk because I don't believe I can handle anything other than this comfort level that I've created. And then that can be a restriction. So I think the question comes down to is, when do you know when to push and when not to push? We have to look at the rest of what's happening in a person's life to establish, do they have a pattern where they're used to shifting gears in order to increase comfortability as a positive, or are they comfortable so it keeps them from increasing anything, not taking a risk or volunteering to do something that they're not sure they can do? And I think it's tough to answer that question. I really do.
Right.
Because everybody's so different. I do think that if you get around other people who are encouraging to you and who have also taken challenges on, it's easier for you to do that because you see the possibility in it, right? And so this is where it gets tricky. The comfort of a label means that I know why it is that I might be doing what I'm doing or expressing what I'm expressing. I think what happens for a lot of people, if you get positive reinforcement for that, it's hard to want to walk away from this because we were highly motivated by validation. If I get validated at a level where I'm not really pushing myself, I might get tricked. I might start to settle into that because it feels good to be validated. And I don't want to risk that going away. And that's connected to that resiliency piece. If I'm not confident in myself, that I don't necessarily need the validation from other people, it's simply a nice thing to get in addition to what God has already told me I am,
Right.
then I could stay stuck because I don't want to risk losing it. I
Right.
don't want to risk losing that
Right.
validation. So that it's complicated. It's not
Right.
it's not as straightforward.
No, it is very complicated. That's
Yeah,
why we need this
that's why we're
conversation.
talking.
Very, very complicated. So, in a case of somebody who is making a statement, I cannot do that because I have, we'll use anxiety.
Right.
Because I have anxiety, you need to know you cannot, don't ask me to do that. I cannot do that. I cannot. Whilst therefore, as a result, staying stuck, not increasing capacity or resiliency. And I did read, they've looked at things and said, you know, when there was the whole lockdown of 2020, coming out of it, we lost some resiliency for some people.
Yeah.
This kind of grew immensely. So how do we help other people, or maybe you yourself are with this, I have anxiety, therefore I cannot do this anymore, or I cannot go here anymore? How do we help people with that? How do we help ourselves get out of that? How can we say to people, not this, you need to increase your capacity and build resiliency, but some people can do that and other people, no, I can't. How do we help people get out of that?
Yeah, the rubber hits the road when what you want isn't accessible because you've restricted yourself from it. And then that's an internal conflict that takes place. I want this, something from column A. I want this thing to happen, or I would like to be exposed to this thing, but I've restricted myself from access to it. And that challenge typically is the thing that puts them over the edge of, I've got to do something different. So in a therapeutic sense, when someone comes in maybe to talk to someone like me, the idea in their head has been generated, right? The process of change, which, for the audience that you're familiar with it, but for the audience, pre-contemplation, contemplation, planning, action, maintenance. And so for someone who's just contemplating or even pre-contemplating, that means they haven't even gotten to the stage of, making A go to B and C. It's just a lot of A.
Yeah.
The idea being is when you get to your threshold and what you are wanting requires choice, that's when you get accelerated into maybe doing something different. So there's a way to process that information to see whether or not it's worth it to you. The risk versus the consequence, and these are things that you can work through, talk through. You can make a like a basic way, pro list, con list, right?
Yeah.
What people tend to get caught up on is a right or wrong, which is too black and white of a definition, and it separates things so distinctly that you don't have a lot of flexibility, again, to risk. So what we try to say to them is this something you want? Yes. Okay, what are we willing to do to make things happen to get in place for this? And I think that starts a different type of contemplation. Now the planning starts to happen, and now we're moving towards change. So that's the answer to that question. How do we help somebody get from doing nothing to the potential of change? That is, you have to help them fine-tune what thinking about it means.
Okay.
So that when the planning starts, now you're moving. And once you move, well, then anything can happen. Now, there's still no guarantee, but that's how you get somebody closer to change and risking, and then potentially saying, the label doesn't identify me. I just proved to myself that I'm capable of doing blank, even though I may have a condition of this, whatever this is, bipolar, depression, anxiety. We talked about the physical, I have diabetes, or I have a deafness in one ear, whatever it is. I still did this. And so what else can I do, even though I might have this identified thing? That's the challenge, right?
Yeah. And so I think it's when a person, though, identifies with the thing
Too much.
so
Right.
much that the thought of not being that anymore is too scary.
Right.
And it sounds like, well, why would you want to be that? But they get the validation.
And this is where it gets tough, though, Des, because the variables that exist in our upbringing, like we mentioned before, what we were brought up in, what's our environment, what's our support system, do we have a faith system attached to that support system? We can't forget there's a lot of people who don't have that.
Yeah.
What's my financial background like? What's my my education background? All the different variables that then come into place that would either push you in a direction to take that risk or not take that risk. And then fundamentally, the thing that we can never overlook and why we're so complicated is because you can't put your finger on the juice inside, a human being that causes them to have fire in a certain way. If we could bottle that, then, and some people talk about it, again, if you use like a spiritual example, when they first get saved, okay, I'm on fire in that moment because my eyes have been, the scales have been removed. I can speak for myself. My wisdom went through the roof. I knew things I didn't know, and I couldn't explain to you why I now knew them. The clarity in my brain was different, and so then I had to do something with it. But I can't speak to everybody who went through that experience later on in life. So there's a really difficult time when we start talking about this topic because the variables are too diverse. Again, if I go back to this idea of labeling something, I want it to make sense to me. Well, that's very important. I have something that is perceived negatively. Why would it be perceived negatively? Oh, I don't know. Social media. Someone when I was growing up, someone told me it was a bad thing. Someone told me not to be that way, like boys don't cry, something generic like that. Whatever it is, there's force working against me that I have to overcome in my own life. And if I don't have the attributes to do that, if I don't have some sense of self to identify that I don't have to do what you said, and we're talking positive now, we're not talking negative, that I can overcome what you've said I'm capable of. Or I can be limited by what you said I am, and that leads to another set of variables. I had prior trauma. I had prior violence. I had prior abuse. I had, and you can think about those things.
Yeah.
That might make me stay stuck. The cycle of abuse speaks to this, that this idea that I can frame your self-esteem around this outside influence, and it's like 3-1. Like there's no specific number, but let's put it like this, 3-1. Sense of self gets negated by 3 times the amount if others are negating you, right? So in other words, I would need 3 positive statements to outdo 1 negative that I say about myself. And then it's just, now you're just at 0. You still haven't really done anything with it. If my esteem is high, then it would take 3 or more negatives to get me to question it, but it doesn't mean I'm going to change my mind. That's kind of the analogy. And that's not in stone, everyone. That's just a...
No, it's more 1,000 to 1 for some people.
Yeah, for some people. So this is what you're up against. Now, what are the variables there? Again, we talked about them. I mean, how do I take care of myself? What's my relationship with Christ? What's my how do I take care of myself physically, intellectually, emotionally?
Let's go there then.
Yeah, okay.
You just mentioned it. Because some people who are listening, I know, wouldn't identify themselves as I am a follower of Jesus.
That's true. That is true.
So let me just lean into that. In this whole realm of mental health we're talking about, in this whole area, I'm just going to say it. I find it, how is it possible to have emotional and mental well-being without faith? I find that astounding. And I'm almost going, so what role does faith play, even in what you're doing in a therapy format? What role does faith play in helping somebody change, get better, move on, become unstuck? How does that unfold for people? And I think this is helpful both for the listener who is, maybe not, because you're here because you've got connection, or no, you do trust God with your life, but you are still limited in your capacity or your resiliency when it comes to your emotional and mental well-being. So speaking to that, just give me your opinion.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I can go better than opinion. I can.
Okay.
We can talk about it from sort of like the depth of involvement of how far you go to move some. So, like cigarette smoking. I know this is going to sound weird. I just started my analogy with cigarette smoking.
All right.
It's not an intellectual problem. I don't think there's anybody out there who thinks smoking's going to be really good for my lungs and stuff. It's really going to help me out. I don't think there's anybody now in the 30s and 40s that might have been a real thing.
Yeah.
Everybody smoked.
Yeah. And
Now, intellectually, we know it's harmful. So what does it tell us? It tells us it goes deeper than that. It's an emotional issue. There's an emotion connected to that problem, and if you're trying to solve it intellectually, you're probably going to fail, or at least you're going to fail multiple times.
Okay.
Most people relapse 7 times on most drugs. There's that's the data, right? So that you try and then you fail. That's because it's not an intellectual issue. And
it's an emotional issue, is what you're saying. There's a craving, or should I say, it supplies comfort.
Well, there's lots of reasons, right?
It puts me at ease.
Yeah,
so,
I got a dessert after every meal, so that's very emotional for me, and it's why I struggle still to this day.
Yeah.
I'm willing to admit that because everybody who knows me knows this, but to always be reinforced to have a dessert after a meal, you kind of get into that, that's affection, that's reinforcement of good thing you just did, here's a good thing for you.
Yeah.
It's not. Again, so let me go back to the original topic. So if it's a physical thing and it's a surface level thing, I might be able to address it physically. I can work out, I can eat better, so if it's just strictly physical. Once we find out that, okay, maybe I had the wrong ideas about it, or I was taught something incorrectly, I might have to go deeper to an intellectual level to try to figure this thing out. Great. Then that runs its course and it's still there, and I'm still feeling despondent, or I'm feeling ashamed, then I know now it's emotional. You're gonna have to unpack some of that to figure out why there's a connection to what would be perceived as a negative emotion. Again, I'm ADD, so I have to throw this out here. No emotions are negative; they're all purposeful. But in this moment, it could be negative. Now I got to go deeper. Now, if I don't have a faith piece, which is the deepest level I can go to, the emotions are going to be it for me. I'm going to navigate emotionally. And this is like a caveat to what we would be talking about in the future here.
Yep.
That once I have emotionally attached myself to a concept or idea, it is very difficult for you to tear me away from that, because it's going to cause me a great deal of pain to change.
Wow. Okay, let's just sit there a minute. Let that one land. You said 2 things there that were really powerful. Number one, that what is that ultimate lowest foundational level of what matters? You're saying, if I don't have faith, it's somewhere else. It really needs to be my emotion. How I feel is the lowest one.
Yes. I mean, anybody who's listening right now, that should just blow your eyes wide open, because that is the struggle of a lot of people that we know and love.
It's a struggle of life. It's a struggle of life. I see it in relationships. This cannot work. Why? Because their lowest form is, this is how this makes me feel.
Correct.
And then and then we have emotional attachment to all, because it's how it makes me feel. So when you there is a parable of building life on sand or life on rock. If the lowest form of you is just sand, my emotions, which are so wow.
And so now that's sinking in, let's just kind of get to the next step.
Yeah, go to it.
Then emotionally, how do we tap in? Well, you've seen it. We've all lived. Art. That's one of the ways it happens. It's through expression. It's through creativity. And you see a lot of that in the connection. It's the way I'm expressing myself. It's the way I'm showing you who I am, because I can't necessarily tell you who I am. And on a deeper level, it's not stabilized by anything other than you have to validate it. The label is very important at this point. So I'm going to tie in. I haven't, so everyone paying attention out there, we're not losing sight. I label it. I have to identify to it, because that strengthens it, which makes me feel safer in my emotion. That doesn't necessarily mean that that's true. It just simply means I've reinforced it. I labeled it. I have an identity in it, so my emotions are safer. At least that's what I'm telling myself. The minute it gets challenged, or the minute it gets spoken to in a different way, you are not violating my intellect. That's not the issue here. You're violating me in my core, because I don't have a deeper level to go to. Now let's speak to this in another way. Creativity. So if I'm emotionally is the depth of me, I'm music, I'm art, I'm whatever, all the creativity things that are very valuable. I'm not dismissing any of that.
Yeah.
But that's the mode of how I get to my deepest part of myself. So what if you don't like my creativity? What if you don't understand it, oh boy. If you don't understand it, now there's a missing piece to my emotional connection to you because you're not understanding me to some extent.
Yes, yes.
When we stabilize that, and I don't want to jump too fast ahead of this, but obviously when we're talking about what the next piece is, the resolution of those things is I'm not having to lean on my own ability at that stage because I have something that is bigger than me that has given me permission to be okay, made whole in him because I'm never going to get. So again, like I said, perfect living. You live your perfect life. You always get to express your art. It's always validated. It's always reinforced. Everyone around you appreciates for what it is, and you're constantly being fed by it. But you're also, athletically taking care of yourself, intellectually stimulating yourself, and everything falls into play. You're not using any drugs, which again, unfortunately, for a lot of people who are emotionally driven, it's very easy when those emotions aren't going well to want to shut them off. And unfortunately for that, there's only a few ways to do that. Substances are one of the ways they do that. That's not an ironic correlation.
Right.
We can talk about that later. But so now you start to see the pattern. The pattern is the depth that I can go to is also the depth of the pain that I can recover from. And so if I know that there's something there that understands my pain better than me and showed me in his own perfect way that suffering is not beyond you. It is a part of what I have promised you.
Suffering is the human experience.
It changes how you look at that.
Yeah.
And it may, I don't want to go out on a limb here, everyone, but that may affect how you can be more resilient.
Yes.
Because you know there's a way through it.
Right.
So set that aside. I don't have that. All I have is my emotions to navigate it through. Well, we know how this works. Any number of things can knock you off of that.
Yeah.
A loss.
Yeah.
A disappointment, a rejection, an abandonment, an abuse. Anything can throw you off of that. That's not stable. That's sand. All right.
Right.
That's not a rock at all.
But we are created emotional.
Yeah.
So emotions are also good.
It's how we navigate the world.
They're critical, in fact. So a lot of, like you're saying, that when we experience physical pain, we want some treatment for it and some maybe medication, but emotional pain, we medicate it. It's what you're saying. We sadly.
Sometimes. I don't want to say all the time, but sometimes,
So how do we handle, how is that, getting back to this identity piece?
Let me give you the extreme. Can I give you the extreme?
Yeah.
The extreme would be someone who has one of 10 personality disorder modalities. They can't medicate it. There's no medication for that. That doesn't get medicated. That is who you are, and that is how you present, and that is how you interact in interpersonal relationship.
Right.
That is a difficult place to be if you have nothing else to lean on besides that thing that is who you are, and sometimes you don't realize is highly distorted to everyone else around you. Mm-hmm. And the pain that comes from that, and the suffering that comes from that. It's very, very sad to see somebody suffer at that level. Honest to God, it is. I mean, I'm speaking from my own experience. That's tough to be in that presentation because they're hurting. And so now, again, if we go back to this idea of how do I recover from that, it takes a long time for someone to learn how to manage and stabilize when that's their conditions. That's the most extreme.
Right.
Regular Joe walking down the street has something happen to them. They have a reaction to it, an emotional, a physical, and an intellectual reaction. If they don't have any systems in place for how they manage their emotion, they might go to their go-to. Well, I'm going to go, I play drums, so I might go sit down in front of a drum set and play. And that might be the depth of how I'm going to really dig into my emotional pain. I'm going to go work out. I'm going to write some poems. I'm going, so that makes sense? So I'm going to, and it's healthy. I'm in a healthy... But the fact that the emotions are there for everyone is great because that's how we navigate. It's how we build with each other. And so I think ultimately, like if you look at, I don't want to bring in Adam and Eve, but I guess I will. When you have, I don't want to go too far down this tangent. I apologize, but it's the best way to explain it. To be in relationship with other people is risky in and of itself because it requires vulnerability. Yes. So when we're talking about emotions, this is where they come into play. Like the emotional content is going to be there whether you want it to or
Yes.
not.
Yes.
And many people struggle when they start to disconnect from that because they're afraid of it or it hurts too much. And so then I see them at some point, right? But if you get ahead of it and you're willing to be exposed to it, then you can grow with it. If I don't have anything to go to deeper than that,
Right.
I'm relying on, I don't know, willpower. I'm relying on whatever my resiliency is from the rest of my life. Right? You came from Australia, I came from
Yeah.
New York, all that stuff. My family environment, maybe it wasn't very good. And that's what I'm now using as my bouncing boards to figure out, okay, how am I going to navigate my current relationship?
Right.
That's harder. It's just, that's all it is. It's not saying it's impossible. It's just that much harder. Can you do it? Yes. You know, smoking's bad for you. George Burns lived to over 100. That's an old reference for everybody out there, but
Right.
he was an outlier. That's not normal.
Correct.
More normal is the ones that don't make it to 100.
Right.
Same thing with this type of thing. If we've seen the data, if faith-based supports mental health, physical health, emotional health, because positive reinforcement and that resiliency idea that I am more than what I have been given
Right.
gets you through the tough stuff. That is the idea of the suffering is inevitable. I used a joke with you before. I've said it last time we were here. I don't remember. But you open up the doors and there's a flamethrower behind one and knives behind the other. And people are looking for the third door without the pain. So again, if I label myself, I am a non-door opener. Well, then I stay stuck.
Yep.
I'm not going to open up those two doors because you've told me there's a chance that it's going to hurt when I do it. That's the comfort that is negative. The comfort that is positive is that because I have been in the place that I am in and I have built myself up, I can go through the door and I will be fine on the other side. And I have a promise to that. That's the other side of what comfort can look like.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? I don't know if that makes sense.
Yeah.
or not.
No, it does make sense, but that requires faith.
But that's the piece
And
you
that's
asked
the
me to touch on.
powerful thing
That's
all the
correct.
time. That
It is.
requires faith. And then it's giving that framework to go, where is my trust? Is there anybody trustworthy? Is there anybody who really cares? Is there anybody who really loves? Is there anybody who really is interested in my pain right now? That's the ultimate. Where is that? You've got to go somewhere. And for us, obviously, foundationally, absolutely the answer to that is yes. But there is an encounter, an experience of that that's only possible when we open that door.
Yeah.
There's no other way of
There's no other way
discovering
there.
it.
Now, you can navigate life without faith. It's just extremely difficult because you are not going to have any sense of ownership over the variables that are coming at you because you can't. You can't dictate to the greater whole how it's going to affect you or see you or view you. They can reject you at any time they want. They can turn away from you any time they want. And in fact, we see it, they do. So again, can you survive? Yes. I'm not telling anybody out there who's listening that you have to believe in God. There's no have to. It's a choice. I'm saying that if you don't have that, you can still live a life. You can still survive. It is extremely difficult to live life with the knowledge of knowing that the Father loves us. It's that much harder to not know. You said, how do people even do that? That's what you said. I think something along paraphrasing you.
Yeah.
How do people even do that?
Yeah.
It takes an extreme amount of just, dominoes fall in the right way for them all to fall and make the big picture. How many times does it take the domino setup person to do that before they get the finished project that they throw up on, how many misfires did they have before it actually worked? Right. And so you get the beautiful picture at the end when all the dominoes have fallen. But I would be surprised if you called those people and said, did it work the first time?
Right.
And they said, sure did.
Right.
If that, and so, it's harder. You can do it way harder.
Yeah. So speaking to this one more thing in terms of, because of time, my brain's hurting, so I don't know what you listeners' brains are going with. Just speak into this reality. Somebody listening, either themselves or they know somebody close to them, is trapped in a label identity. Just give us a simple, how practically, what can we do to help? What does therapy do for them? How do we get there? Because for a lot of people, they've still got to get to a point where I want to change.
Yes.
I mean, the first step is if you want change, the first reality is I have to know that if I don't want to be here, I've got to make a step. But that is bigger than. So, how can we help? Maybe it's yourself listening or somebody we know to go, you're stuck right now. You don't have to live with that label. How do we help them move forward?
You said the biggest part of it, the desire. My job would be to help them look at their current situation and ask them if this is what their end game or their goal was. Then there really isn't a desire to do anything. You don't need therapy. You don't need to worry about your label because you've met its expectation and you're content with it. If you come in or if you're out there and you say, I'm not content with it, you've answered the question already.
Right.
You're not okay. It is taking away from you or it's hurting you for that matter. And your desire to move away from that requires you to let go of what the label is, what someone else is telling you you are, or what you are telling you you are. That there's just no way to do that without letting go. That I have to do it like a 5'6" person does it, because that's how tall I am.
Right.
I cannot do anything outside of what a 5'6" person can do, and that limit does more to constrain you than to allow you to have access. And I think that's the trap that's happened in recent years is because I had the label, I did think I had access. It did open me up to a group of people. It did allow me, see, that's the trap that we were talking about earlier. That's the damage that's being done. And that's, you said COVID. Well, we won't dive down that hole, but I will say this about it. You took away 2 years of, especially for younger people, the mirroring, which is how we, like how we develop our ability to, what do I do when I'm standing in front of a group full of people? Well, I watch them. And if my behavior is inappropriate, they let me know. Usually that's how it works. And then you don't do that behavior again. And so they lost 2 years of that in their brain formation as to how to navigate social situations. We still haven't fully seen how that's playing out, but we're starting to see it. Some younger people can't interview. They can't sit down and talk about themselves in the appropriate parameter of an interview because it's not accessible to them. It makes no sense to do this. So this is tricky now. And I'll say one more thing about the what you're talking about, which is how do I move past the label that I'm stuck in? When you are watching someone else, if you get where I'm coming from there, everybody who knows what the internet is like, you are caught up in a spiral of distancing yourself from your own self-awareness and self-esteem, which then means you can be easily labeled. And I mean that in not the positive form of comforting.
Right.
You've been labeled to the point of restriction, and now it hurts to break free from that because maybe your emotional content has been connected to that. So that's, I know I didn't answer it simple. It's so hard to do it simple because you mentioned the biggest part. You have to have a want.
Right.
You have to have a want. And if what's happening in your life is hurting you, that might be your motivation to decide the label is no longer helping me. Even if you thought it was a positive label, let me offend everybody. Christian, even if you thought the label was helpful, you have to be careful with the label if it's hurting you.
At that point, we'll end this episode. The maladaptive, we'll get there next week.
Okay.
You know what I mean? Brief description of what that is to bring people back.
Maladaptive means that the way you're going about it is not getting you to what you thought. The expectations are completely opposite. And in fact, sometimes you're getting the opposite response and you think it's them, not you.
Wow.
Sorry.
Hope that triggers enough curiosity for us all to tune into our next episode. Thanks, Lenny. Thanks, everybody. Life is complex in the middle, but that's where we do real life. It's right there in the middle. Hope this was helpful to you. Reach out to us in any way, shape, or form you want to. We'll see you next time.
Share and like.